Okay, the next topic, I want to add a little bit more from what we talked about in the hydrologic lecture in the past. We talked about the oceans, about how 97% of Earth's water is in the ocean, not fresh water. And they also cover about 71% of the Earth. And a large percentage of people live near coast. So in the past, we've discussed issues related to sea level change. And I want to take that a little further and talk about different kinds of sea level changes. There's what's called eustatic sea level change. That is change to the volume of the ocean. If you recall, we've talked about during the ice ages, sea levels were lower, and with global warming, sea levels are higher. Those are both examples of what's called eustatic sea level change. Now, there is a second way that sea level can change too. The land can actually move up and down because of tectonic activity. But for now, let's focus on eustatic activity, about changes from the ice ages to today and potential future changes with global warming. All right, so with changing sea levels, you can have different kinds of coastlines. You can have what's called emergent coastlines. So when sea levels are going down or land is rising, you can have new coastal areas that used to be underneath the water. Land can emerge from underneath the water. But more importantly, I want to focus on submergent coastlines. These are areas that used to be above the water, above sea level, that are now under sea level. So things that perhaps were river valleys or glacial valleys during the ice ages and then have since been flooded with sea level rise. And I want to discuss two particular types of features, one associated with rivers, one associated with glaciers. A ria is a flooded river valley. So if you remember, there's V-shaped valleys created by rivers. If those flood, it becomes what's called a ria, where the U-shaped valleys for glaciers, when they're flooded, they're what's called a fjord. So if you recall, we looked at A versus B in the past, where A is the V-shaped river valley and B is the U-shaped glacial valley. And if you were to flood them both, you would have two different features. You would have a ria, which is a flooded river valley, V-shaped valley, or if you flood this glacial valley, that would be called a fjord. It's a Norwegian term because Norway has a whole bunch of these things. And another topic about islands, I want to talk about a little bit more about island formation. And so we've talked about geologic hotspots. So there's different kinds of islands. Some islands, like the British Isle, are not really true islands. They're actually part of the continent that's just been cut off with sea level rise. But oceanic islands are true islands. They're created primarily by geologic hotspots, like the Hawaiian Islands. And Charles Darwin, who's the father of evolution, when they were sailing around collecting species for him to look at, he also had this interesting insight by looking at different islands and thought about the evolution of islands themselves. So these are different islands in different places, but they seem to be at a different step of evolution. Tahiti here looks like a brand new volcanic island. Oahu looks like a little bit older one and starting to develop a reef around it. And this one here, Miat Island, is a little bit older still, where it has the reef around it, but the island is starting to erode away. Truk Island here is even older still, where the reef is remaining, but there's only a little bit of the volcanic island left, till finally you end up at what's called an atoll. An atoll is a coral reef that remains after a volcanic island has been eroded away. So the idea is that you have a hotspot, you have a volcanic island, and you have a reef that develops around that island. Now, the reef is going to be more resistant to erosion by the ocean and by rain and what have you than the island itself. And so the island starts to be eroded away. Erosion takes place, but less so on the reef around it. So here we end up with what's called a barrier reef, a little bit off the coast. And then eventually you end up with a feature like this called an atoll. An atoll is kind of the coral reef feature that remains. It grew up around the volcano, but as the volcano eroded, it's the only thing. So it's called an atoll. It's a ring of coral reefs that grew around a subsiding or eroding volcano. Here's a little bit of pictures. This is an island with a reef around it, a good healthy volcanic island in the middle. Here's an example where you have the reef, but the not so much volcanic island, and then eventually this is what an atoll looks like. There had been a volcanic island here, but eroded away, leaving behind just the coral reef, which is called an atoll. So these are rings of coral reef that grew around a subsiding volcano. That's what they're associated with. And the reason the reefs are left behind is that they're wave resistant. They're created, actually they're not created as rock material, they're biologic material. They're created by sea creatures accumulating, it's an accumulation of dead sea creature skeletons that actually create the reef. And it's a different material than the rock, and so it doesn't erode as easily. Now you don't have these everywhere. There is a certain conditions that have to exist for coral reefs. This is a map that shows the general distribution of coral reefs. So they're not everywhere, but where you can create a coral reef, this is a feature that can develop around a subsiding volcano out in the middle of the ocean, creating an atoll.